Sylvester Stallone sat in business class, his gaze fixed on the airplane window, but he couldn't find peace. Everything had happened so quickly. He was supposed to be on a different flight, but due to technical issues, he ended up on a regular flight with ordinary passengers. Instead of a luxurious cabin and special privileges, he found himself among people who had no idea who was sitting next to them. His red suit, of course, looked elegant, but he felt out of place among these modestly dressed people. Sylvester tried to hide his frustration, but he couldn't ignore the stares from some passengers, and the two men sitting ahead of him had started whispering behind his back. "Look who it is, the old fool," one of them said, laughing loudly, though he tried to speak quietly. The other man gave Sylvester a brief glance, not caring that he could hear them. "Do you think he can still fly without assistance?" Sylvester felt something stir inside him. He could have simply turned his head and responded sarcastically, or even intervened in their rude behavior. But instead, he took a deep breath and stayed calm. He knew times had changed, and now he needed to be wise, not aggressive. A few minutes later, the younger of the two men approached him and said, "Listen, old man, this is our seat. You probably sat here by mistake. You need to move to the seats for people like you." Sylvester felt a fire rising in his chest, but again he took a deep breath and looked the man in the eye. "You know, I sit where it's comfortable for me," he said calmly, without changing his tone. The man, with undisguised anger, leaned closer. "And you want to tell me that you're comfortable sitting here, among us, regular people? You probably don't deserve this seat." Ignoring the aggression, Sylvester looked at the man and replied slowly, "You know, I've seen a lot in my life, and I've learned one thing. We are all equal. Even if you break yourself trying to look better, it doesn't change the essence." The younger man fell silent, unsure how to respond, and took a few steps back. Only the older man, who remained in his seat, laughed with a crooked smile. "So, you want to talk about equality? You'll never understand our world, old man," he said, turning back to his seat. Sylvester, although irritated, didn't say anything. His gaze remained calm, and he waited for the tension in his mind to slowly dissipate. But when the plane slightly shook and everyone in business class began to rise to prepare for the 1-hour flight, Sylvester heard a familiar voice from behind him. "Well, tired of discussing old fools?" The same man spoke again. This time, Sylvester, fully aware of his rudeness, turned and confidently addressed him. "It's never too late to learn more than just argue with others. Peace and wisdom, that's the greatest achievement, especially at our age. You can talk to me, or if you prefer, I can just sit back and enjoy the flight." The conflict wasn't over, but there was something in his gaze that began to change the atmosphere. Passengers in business class started to notice his calm yet strong reaction. The plane continued its flight, and the air was filled with new, uncomfortable silences that these two men couldn't understand. What would happen next? Suddenly, two passengers approached Sylvester, a man and a woman, around 50 years old. They looked like a typical suburban couple. The man wore a light gray suit, and the woman was dressed in an elegant coat. At first, they carefully examined Sylvester, and then the man started speaking. "Excuse me," he said with a strange tone, "but it seems like you're sitting in our seat." Sylvester raised an eyebrow, hearing the tone, which bordered on aggression, and for a moment he was surprised. It seemed like some kind of joke, or perhaps another misunderstanding. "This is my seat," he replied calmly, slightly noticing the man's gaze, which was clearly displeased. The woman, standing nearby, stepped forward and, looking at Sylvester, said with a hint, "This seat was reserved for us, and you better leave, old man. This is not your place." Sylvester tilted his head back, as if it were just a joke, but the faces of the man and woman remained serious. He took a deep breath and paused for a moment. His years in show business, where he constantly dealt with people trying to manipulate others, had further strengthened his patience and ability to keep his composure. He responded calmly, but there was now clear confidence in his voice. "I understand that you may not know who I am, but I'm sitting in my seat. And this seat belongs to me," he said, emphasizing each word louder. The man smiled slightly, but it was not a friendly smile, rather an attempt to undermine the situation. "Maybe we didn't start off right," he said, but his tone was still unpleasant. "You're getting old, and in the end, you shouldn't take up so much space in business class. We don't want trouble, but we're both dealing with something bigger." Sylvester shrugged. All these words were just empty noise that meant nothing to him. He looked at them more closely, trying to understand why these people were being so aggressive towards him. But his heart didn't race from anger or irritation. He knew that anger wouldn't solve the conflict, so instead of snapping, he chose to stay calm. "I understand your point of view," he said calmly. "But I have the right to be here, where I was seated. And I just came here to rest before an important meeting. This is not the place for conflict, if you want my advice." The woman froze for a moment. She looked surprised because she hadn't expected such a response. And the man, apparently realizing that he hadn't managed to provoke Sylvester, moved to the window, as if deciding to ignore him, but his gaze remained tense. But Sylvester stayed calm. He knew that this moment was another test of endurance and patience. These people seemed to never consider how important it was to remain balanced in such situations. And while other passengers were carefully watching the scene, Sylvester felt that this could be a chance to change the atmosphere, even in such a tense situation. And just when the man and woman decided to retreat and sit in their seats, Sylvester addressed them with a smile. Life doesn't always have to be a battle. We're all just people. Maybe we could be kinder to one another." It was a short phrase, but it made an impression on those around them, and even on Sylvester himself. Because at that moment, he realized that true strength lies not in aggression or despair, but in the calm confidence you can show, even when it feels like the world is crashing down on you. The woman and the man shrugged and returned to their seats. The plane continued to fly above the clouds, and although the atmosphere remained tense, it was no longer as oppressive. Sylvester looked out the window, feeling the other passengers watching the situation, and felt that this was another small step toward change in the world. Sylvester leaned back in his seat again, but his thoughts couldn't shake off what had just happened. He could still feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, but it seemed they no longer viewed him the same way as before. Perhaps each of them had started wondering why there hadn't been an explosion of aggression, why this man, older than most on board, remained so calm in a situation that could irritate anyone. Through it all, his heartbeat remained steady, and even the strange atmosphere around him couldn't disturb his peace. The plane continued to ascend, and he almost forgot about what lay ahead. But there was still one question that troubled him. Why did these people seem so angry? Why do even such situations turn into not just misunderstandings, but full-on battles? Meanwhile, after a brief pause, the woman, who had remained by the window, glanced over her seat and whispered to the man, "He really doesn't seem to understand who we are." The man shrugged, as if to suggest it wasn't worth paying attention to such trivialities. But something in the woman's voice showed that she was more interested in the situation than she would have liked to admit. She couldn't understand how, in a world where everyone strives to win every battle, someone could remain so calm and confident. Sylvester turned back to the window, staring into the darkness that was gradually enveloping the earth below. His eyes softened as he remembered how not long ago he had been completely different. Like everyone he once sought more, wanted to win every situation, prove his superiority. But now, none of that mattered to him. Now he simply understood that what mattered more was how you perceive life, not how life perceives you. A few minutes later, after the plane entered a calmer phase of flight, Sylvester felt his inner peace reaching new depths. It seemed as if everything around him had become quieter. Even the pressure in the air was less noticeable. The passengers who had been observing him now only cast brief glances, but the aggression or mistrust was gone. Suddenly, he heard a voice. "Would you mind if we came over for a minute?" It was the same woman approaching him again, but this time she didn't look as insistent. Her voice was softer, almost polite. Sylvester was slightly surprised, but his intuition told him that perhaps this was a moment to open something new. "Please," he said, offering a slight smile. "How can I help?" They sat next to him, and the man began. "To be honest, we wanted to apologize for our reaction. We didn't fully understand the situation, and it seems we didn't know how to behave in such a case. But we saw how you handled the pressure. And at some point, we realized we had no right to impose our rules on others." The woman added, "We just don't really like being ignored. It's a habit of ours. But you helped us understand that other things are more important." Sylvester looked at them with mild surprise, as he hadn't expected such an approach. "It's not that hard. We all live in our own world and forget that we don't always have to fight. Sometimes it's enough just not to let stress or aggression take the lead. That's the most important thing." The man and the woman nodded silently, and the atmosphere in the plane became even more peaceful. Instead of tension and uncertainty, a sense of harmony emerged. Sylvester felt that even in such difficult situations, when people usually try to win, there could be a way to find a peaceful resolution. And all that was needed for that was the ability to be yourself and open to others. And although they didn't speak anymore, this brief moment became an important change for them all. The plane had already begun its descent, and the view of the city from above was becoming clearer. All the passengers were still sitting in silence, but the atmosphere had changed. Sylvester, feeling this shift, smiled. His heartbeat was steady, and this flight had become something more than just a journey. It was a moment when he realized that it wasn't just about getting somewhere, but also about how you do it, who you are in the process. The woman and the man he had spoken to no longer seemed like strangers to him. Their gazes had softened, and it even seemed like a new understanding had emerged between them. They no longer looked at him with suspicion or judgment. Now, it seemed they had embraced the calm he had brought to this moment. As the plane neared landing, Sylvester felt everything around him come to a standstill. It was a strange but soothing feeling. Instead of rushing through life, he simply enjoyed the moment. And perhaps that was what he had been missing before. He was increasingly convinced that it's not just about reaching the end, but about learning to listen to others and to yourself. The plane landed gently, and all the passengers began gathering their belongings. Sylvester stood up, and as he passed by the woman and the man, they exchanged glances once more, but this time the look was warm and grateful. "Thank you," the woman said quietly. Sylvester smiled and nodded, not saying a word. That was enough. When everyone had exited the plane and began going their separate ways, he felt something had changed inside him. He didn't yet know how it would affect his life going forward, but he sensed that this flight had been more than just a trip from point A to point B. It had been a path to a new, more aware version of himself. And when he stepped outside, where a taxi was waiting for him, a smile appeared on Sylvester's face. He knew everything would be different for him now. As Sylvester got into the taxi, he settled back into the seat, feeling an unexpected sense of calm. The city around him, once just a blur of buildings and lights, now seemed full of possibilities. He had always been in a hurry before, racing through life, chasing one goal after another. But now, everything felt slower, more deliberate. The driver, a middle-aged man with a warm smile, greeted him as he began driving through the city streets. Sylvester glanced out the window, watching the lights flash by, but his mind was no longer preoccupied with the past or the future. For the first time in a long while, he was simply present. The taxi made its way through familiar streets, but they felt new to Sylvester now. It was as if the journey he had just experienced, not just a flight, but the moments of quiet reflection, had opened his eyes to the world in a different way. The noise and rush of everyday life seemed distant now, replaced by a quiet understanding. When the taxi reached his destination, Sylvester stepped out, tipping the driver, before heading into the building. As he entered his apartment, he noticed the familiar objects around him, the worn couch, the pictures on the walls, but they didn't feel quite the same. It was as though he was seeing them with new eyes, with a deeper appreciation for the little things that had always been there. He sat down on the couch, thinking about the flight, about the people he had met, and about how he had changed. The calmness he had felt during the flight still lingered, settling over him like a blanket. He didn't know what would come next, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid. Whatever happened, he felt ready for it. And in that moment, Sylvester realized that the journey he had taken wasn't just about the physical distance he traveled. It was about discovering something important within himself, the ability to embrace stillness, to listen, and to live with intention. He smiled, knowing that the world was still full of challenges, but he was no longer in a race to conquer them. Instead, he was simply moving forward, one step at a time, with a quiet confidence that he hadn't known he had. The journey had only just begun,